All right. Again, I am Mary Ellen Middleton, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters. And I'm delighted that you are all here this evening for this program. It's part of our programs and the Ideas Forum that we hold for most months. And tonight's the topic and the title of tonight's program is Lower Your Carbon Footprint and Cast a Carbon Shadow. And we are fortunate tonight to have the presentation done by Cathy Clarkin. And Cathy is by background an environmental chemist, and she currently works for Fermilab in their education program. Cathy is the executive director of Accelerate Climate Solutions and the co-chair of the Naperville Environment and Sustainability Task Force, also known as NEST. Cathy is going to talk about the various ways you can reduce your carbon pollution in your home and lifestyle while saving money, and about the carbon shadow and the ways to create broader change to address the climate crisis. So tonight, Cathy is going to be talking until about 7:45. At which time we will have a Q&A portion of the program. And in the course of the program, if you have any questions, if you would put that in the chat box, and I will be monitoring those. And then also, if you don't want to use the chat box at the end, you can raise your hand, and I will do my very best to cover what questions I can that have been put in the chat box, and then also you yourself. I will call on you to ask Cathy any questions that you have. And in the course of her program, she's going to have a couple of questions for you, and you can respond to that again in that chat box. So Cathy, if you're ready, you can go ahead and start your program. Thank you very much for being here.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I am a member of the League of Women Voters of Naperville, and it's such a great organization. So I feel really honored to be here. It's really a vital organization in our community, promoting civic engagement and, supporting really important pieces of legislation. So thank you for having me. As mentioned, my name is Cathy Clarkin, and I am co-chair of NEST and founder and executive director of the local nonprofit Accelerate Climate Solutions. And before I jump into the presentation, I'd like to just quickly tell you a little bit about these two organizations. So NEST is an all-volunteer task force, and it advises our government, our schools, our businesses, and our community on sustainability and greenhouse gas reduction. I'd like to invite all of you to our monthly meetings, which happen on the third Monday evening of the month. Typically, those are at the Municipal Center, but we also have a hybrid Zoom option. Actually, our speaker for this month happens to be joining us tonight, Tom Coleman. He's also going to be talking about what you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. We always have great speakers. Becky Simon has been one of our speakers. Susan Craighead has spoken. So people that you're familiar with, you can find those videos on our website. And while you're on our website, you can also check out our 10 committees and how to get involved and learn, benefit from some of the resources that we have there. And Accelerate Climate Solutions was founded to support implementation of climate solutions here in Naperville, in Aurora, and surrounding communities. So we have a little broader scope. And our website is full of information that I hope you can use to help you make your home more energy efficient, access incentives and rebates, all sorts of great information there. And we also work with a variety of local organizations to improve their energy efficiency and expand solar. So we, for example, work with faith organizations and nonprofits and schools and things like that. Our other purpose is really to build future environmental leaders through high school programs and internship opportunities. All right. Whoops. Sorry about that. One more housekeeping thing before I get started. I just want to mention a couple of definitions. Throughout the evening, when I talk about the gases that warm our atmosphere, I'm going to use these terms: greenhouse gases, carbon pollution, carbon emissions, carbon, CO2, which is carbon dioxide equivalents, or just carbon dioxide. So those are all kind of interchangeable. And then we have the terms climate crisis, climate emergency, climate change, global warming, global heating. Those also are used interchangeably to describe the increase in the average global temperature that leads to changes in weather patterns and consequent humanitarian impacts. All right. I am assuming that if you're joining this meeting tonight, you already know that climate change is real, as do most Americans, that the planet is warming, that it's caused by human activity, and the consequences are going to impact humans and nature. The average global temperature has increased 1.2 degrees Celsius or 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880. And this increase has happened even as our sunspot activity has been lower than average in the last few decades. You probably saw the headlines this summer about the oceans heating up. You've heard about the loss of Arctic sea ice, which leads to sea level rise, which leads to coastal flooding, which leads to climate displacement and migration. And you may have even heard that the increasingly hot days and nights can lead to higher rates of violence, including shootings and domestic violence. Maybe you're starting to connect some dots with other issues. Maybe you're connecting the climate change with the migrant crisis, or the tornadoes that hit Naperville with climate change, or even flooding or drought that we've experienced. So you've heard all these things, and hopefully that has spurred you to want to take some kind of action to be part of addressing climate change. And if you're like me, you probably started with a Google search and came up with a bunch of different answers that may have left you scratching your head to know exactly what are the specific things that I should be doing personally to make a difference. This information overload can leave you a bit confused and maybe even wondering if your personal actions make a difference. I know that this is where I started out in my journey, just a little bit confused. So I'm here tonight to tell you that you taking action on climate change does matter, and in a way that's kind of similar to voting. So does your one vote count? Well, most elections are not won by a margin of one vote. Occasionally they are, but mostly they aren't. But then think about, what if you didn't vote and your spouse didn't vote and only your most extreme neighbors voted? Then maybe you start thinking, well, maybe my vote does make a difference. So collectively, voting is really critical, and we all need to participate in that because it's the way that we have a voice in our government. Similarly, you and your family adding solar or eating less red meat doesn't by itself make a dent in the climate crisis. But collectively, if a lot of people are doing that, and if when we do this, we influence other people to do it, then really carbon emissions start coming down in the gigatons. When we take personal action to reduce our carbon footprint, that sends a signal to the business community and to our elected officials that this is something people care about. which in turn causes them to adopt more sustainable practices, create green products, develop incentives, which in turn, in a positive feedback, helps us as consumers and voters make better choices that reduce our carbon emissions. So here we come to focusing on the actions that you can take to reduce your family's carbon footprint and to create something that maybe you have not heard of before, a carbon or climate shadow. And what I mean by that is your influence to create broader change to address the climate crisis and to think of yourself beyond being just simply a consumer. After all, what we really want are systems and policies that make it easy for us to make the best choices that will avert the worst impacts of climate change so that we don't have to keep Googling, how do I reduce my carbon footprint, when we have those systems and policies. This notion of a climate or carbon shadow comes from the journalist Emma Patty. And she says you can think of your carbon shadow in 3 parts: my consumption, my choices, and my attention. So consumption incorporates lifestyle expectations like what temperature do I set my air conditioner at? How much am I purchasing? What am I buying? And our carbon footprint. And if folks are not yet familiar with that term, that's basically means the amount of climate change gases that all of your activities are contributing to the atmosphere. There are all sorts of statistics out there about per capita carbon footprint for different areas, different countries. My choices would include things like how I donate and invest my money, the number of children and pets I have, and what kind of work I do and who do I work for. And then my attention is maybe even the most important. How much of my attention is focused on the climate crisis? How many hours am I devoting to taking action? Is it at least as much as I spend watching Netflix? The way that I've kind of organized the rest of the talk is I've kind of taken that my choices point and put it with consumption and put it with attention, because I feel like my choices kind of fit in with both of those. So I've rolled it together. And I'm going to tackle my attention first and do my consumption, which is more about your carbon footprint, last. I want to start here with my attention and the related choices that we make, again, because I think it's not as familiar to people as your carbon footprint. When surveyed, Americans cite recycling as the top way that they think that they can help with climate change. I hope you're all recycling. It's a great thing to do, but it is not the number one thing that you can do to be part of climate action. So that's what we're going to talk about. Let's start by thinking about what really it takes to tackle climate change. Addressing climate change is generally described as mitigation and adaptation. So on the mitigation side, we're reducing the sources of carbon pollution, which mostly come from burning fossil fuels. And we're also supporting those parts of nature that hold on to carbon. That's called carbon sinks. So those are things like healthy soils, trees, prairies, the ocean. When we come to adaptation, we know that the planet has already warmed, and we know that it is going to continue to warm to some degree. And so we have to adapt to a new climate. And that means building resilient infrastructure. For example, that would be something like we need in certain areas larger storm drains because we are having bigger, heavier rainfall events. Building strong communities is important because we need to be there for each other when disaster strikes. And helping our neighbors and even those across the globe who are impacted by rising sea levels, heat waves, droughts, floods, storms, all those things that come along with climate change. So that is climate action too, helping people who are impacted.
No, yeah.
Oh. So some of you may have seen me share this diagram before if you've seen me talk before, but this is a concept popularized by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who's an oceanographer and a climate communicator. This helps you think through how you can fit into climate action. So mitigation and adaptation have many parts to them, and there are many problems that need solving. But then there are also those things that you're already interested in and the skills that you have or you're developing. And if you find that sweet spot in the middle, that's where you can get to work. So for example, the League of Women Voters, we're, of course, interested in democracy, and we've built some skills to help ensure that everyone has access to the ballot and to work towards passing meaningful legislation. We have those kind of skills. And actually, it turns out that these are really important pieces of tackling climate change. The more representative our democracy is, the more that we will see action by our politicians to address the climate crisis. And that's because it is a popular issue with Americans. People want to see climate action. And we also know that if we don't take action to mitigate and adapt to climate change, those adaptation costs as the temperature rises are going to be even higher and higher. So it is a popular economic thing to address climate change. So when the League of Women Voters is working on making a more perfect democracy, they're actually working to help on climate solutions. That's just one example. If you're a techie or a fashion diva or a gardener or a foodie, you can find a place to make a difference that is actually going to help with the climate crisis. Another thing to think about when you think about how you can fit into climate action is this concept of intersectionality. The problems we're trying to solve when we address the climate crisis touch on things like women's rights, racial equity, labor, health, and many other things. So, for example, migration and internal displacement cause humanitarian catastrophes, not just overseas, but here in North America. Those can be driven by climate change. If you are working on things like reproductive rights or refugee housing, or you're supporting women's shelters or international aid agencies, or you're providing job opportunities to returning citizens, you are probably helping people who are impacted by climate change and environmental injustice. So when you reframe your thinking, you'll realize that you probably are doing a lot more than just recycling. And the more you put this climate lens on the things that you do, the more that you can see ways to make a difference. And if you don't have that climate lens now, a great place to start is to learn. So again, to focus your attention on these issues. I have on the screen here some resources that I really like. I love listening to podcasts. I do that a lot. Maybe you can take a screenshot. Otherwise, we'll make sure that we get these lists out to folks after the end of the presentation. And I will just point out a couple of these books that I have here, because I think they're a really great place to start if you don't know much about these issues. One is All We Can Save. It's an anthology of essays written by women, covering many aspects of the climate crisis. And so it kind of paints that nice broad picture of what is happening and what kind of projects folks are working on. And then Saving Us is the other thing I would really like to highlight. It's by Katharine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist and communicator. And she helps readers understand how to connect to other people across shared values to spur climate action. A point that she makes is that the majority of Americans, as I said, are concerned about climate change, but guess what? People are not talking about it. This obviously doesn't apply to me because I talk about it all the time, but most people don't have a conversation about climate change for like a whole month or even more. So simply having conversations changes the public discourse, which changes political will, which leads to political action. So even just talking about climate change is climate action. All right, we're about to move into the carbon footprint part of the evening, but let's spend a moment talking about this diagram. So in life, you can apply this diagram to pretty much anything in life, but when it comes to the climate crisis, of course, there are things that are directly under your control, and that's more your carbon things that are part of your carbon footprint, probably. And then there's the things where you have some influence, and that's more what we think of as our carbon shadow, where we can exert some influence. And then, of course, the things that you have no control over. So when it comes to your influence, you can vote. You can get involved in a political campaign. You can join an organization like Nest and get involved. I will highlight one thing that Nest is doing that I think everyone needs to know about. We are talking a lot about the problem that we have in Naperville with 80% of our electricity coming from coal. So if you want to do something about that, get involved in Nest. You can also think about other places where you might have an influence, whether it's your place of work, your place of worship, some other organization, your family you're involved with. How can you influence them to be more sustainable and think about their greenhouse gas emissions? You can get civically involved, which is a great thing for folks in the league to do. By speaking in front of city council or a school board, writing your elected officials, and again, getting back to that idea of just talking about climate change, talking about what you're doing that can create influence. As I said, we're going to talk about the carbon footprint next. And these things up here that you have no control or no influence over, just let it go. All right, carbon footprint. So the concept of a carbon footprint was actually developed by a petroleum company to shift the responsibility for global warming away from corporations to the individual. So that's not so great, but the fact is that our carbon footprint actually can make a difference in stopping greenhouse gas emissions. But that wasn't really the case even a few years ago to the degree that it is now, because when I first started working on climate solutions, many of the climate communicators that I listened to were dismissing the idea of a carbon footprint because relying on individuals to do the right thing, you know, that's a tough sell. Like, think about flying. probably most of you know that flying causes a lot of carbon emissions. But the number of people that are actually cutting back on the miles that they fly is pretty tiny. So relying on them is not really working. But what if instead of trying to convince everyone to fly less, public and private research dollars were spent on zero emission airplanes? Then the problem is solved for everyone. So developing technologies, systems, policies, passing laws is really the main route to meaningful carbon reduction. It's part of the reason we want to cast a carbon shadow to spur these systems and policy changes. But it does turn out that folks in the climate community actually succeeded last year in creating some policies that will help you and me and all of us as consumers to lower our own carbon footprint. And so that positive feedback loop that I mentioned earlier sends the ball back into our court to make personal changes. And this came about because of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. So hopefully some of you have heard of that. Tom Coleman, who is speaking at Nest later this month, he's going to talk a lot about these kitchen table decisions, like the car you buy, or when is it time to get a new air conditioner. They're actually a critical piece of addressing climate change. Project Drawdown says they're 20 to 30% of the puzzle, and then sources like Rewiring America and Climate Reality put it more like 40%. So that's a big chunk. Your decisions about your carbon footprint can really have an impact on the climate crisis. So here's the first point in the evening that I would like to ask all of you a question, and I hope that you will put your responses in the chat. What do you think the best way is for you to reduce your carbon footprint? Anybody have any ideas? We already said recycling is not the number one way.
Here's someone said to get rid of a car.
Oh, I like that.
Reduce fossil fuels. Reduce food waste. Reuse. Install solar. All right. Go live in a tent.
Go live in
and grow your own veggies. Air source heat pump.
Okay, great.
Become a vegan.
Okay. Awesome. Well, this is great because I'm ready to talk about all those things. So those are all great things, no doubt. All right. So according to Dr. Leah Stokes, who is a climate policy expert, the number one thing that you can do about climate change is electrify. All right, I hope to give you now some practical, concrete things that you can do to electrify and to make some lifestyle choices, which I heard both of those things in those responses, which is awesome. So I promise you that everything we talk about will actually make your life better as well. Okay, when we talk about electrification, we are actually talking about getting rid of natural gas in your home. And I would be really interested if any of you have any specific comments or questions about that during our Q&A session at the end. And we're replacing all that those natural gas appliances with energy efficient electric appliances. And then, of course, we're electrifying transportation as well. So what does electrification involve? Things that we talked about a little bit already, I heard in the responses: solar, Heat pumps to replace your furnace and AC. Love to answer questions about that. I love talking about my heat pump. Smart thermostat, so we can control the temperature even when we're outside of the house. Heat pump water heaters, induction stoves. I have one of those too. Happy to answer questions about that. Heat pump clothes dryers. Of course, electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging. And then sometimes when we do all this electrification in the home, we need some upgrades to our electrical panel and wiring. There are incentives and rebates for that. And then this is something that everybody can go home and do tonight or do tomorrow. Replace all your lights with LEDs if you haven't done that yet. You can even get free LED light bulbs at the municipal center if you live in Naperville. And then of course, we want to be as energy efficient as possible. So we want to do insulation and air sealing. Oh, I will mention also on this slide that, this is cleanenergy.gov, and there are a lot of good resources there for you. So if you want to make a note of that. All right, digging in a little bit to why we want to get rid of natural gas in our homes and electrify. Well, no more natural gas means increased health and safety. So when you eliminate natural gas from your home, there's no more risk of carbon monoxide poisoning, your air quality improves, you have lower risk of asthma. Benzene is a carcinogen, it leaks into our homes when we have natural gas in our homes. There's no more natural gas smells. And I'm sure all of you saw that news about that exploding house in Lisle. That was a natural gas leak. So you don't have any more risk of that. And if you choose an induction stove, it's really much safer around kids, less likely to get burned and things like that. And then, of course, we're also home electrifying mainly for the carbon impact. So methane is the main ingredient of natural gas, and it leaks throughout the system from the time it's extracted and even inside your home. And it is a very potent greenhouse gas. So that's a big contributor to our global warming. And then when we burn methane, it creates carbon dioxide, which of course is also a greenhouse gas. Electric appliances are much more energy efficient than gas appliances. So even here in Naperville, where we have 80% of our electricity coming from coal, it is still better to have electric appliances. They can be as much as 4 times more efficient. And also, you can be more comfortable in a home. Usually heat pumps have a lot less up and down in the temperature. So you have a lot more steady temperature, more management of humidity in your home. So they can be very comfortable as well. And for all of these things and more, there are lots of incentives. So this is about the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, tax credits. And I'm not going to read this slide to you, but just know that they're out there to make these upgrades to electrify and insulate your home. There's additional tax credits also for solar and for geothermal or ground source heat pumps, which is another way to heat and cool your home. And if you remember one thing from tonight's presentation, remember this website, rewiringamerica.org. They have what's called an IRA calculator, and that will help you understand all the federal incentives that are available to you. And then they just are launching a planning tool so you can make your own plan to electrify your home. And when you put your information in this calculator, you'll also see that there are some opportunities for low and moderate income households to get even more rebates and incentives. And then there's also weatherization assistance programs that are available for low and moderate income. So you don't have to remember all these details, but just remember this website and just remember we are here. Both Nest and Accelerate Climate Solutions are here to help you navigate all these things and make these decisions and make sure that you're getting all these incentives and rebates. There are also rebates available from the electric utilities. So if you are a Naperville electric utility customer, you have to sign up first to the renewable energy program before you can access those rebates. It costs a minimum of $5 a month, but then you have access to rebates for upgrading your windows, your insulation, getting EV chargers, solar, all those kind of things. And then NICOR and ComEd also have rebates. So we have all these great incentives, and let's look at what that means. So stacking, here's a solar scenario, stacking the federal tax credits, the Naperville Renewable Energy Program rebate, the solar renewable energy credits, also called SRECs. The net cost for a $30,000 solar system could be as low as $8,000. And then if your electricity bill is $1,500 a year, your payback time is about 5 years. And then that solar system is probably going to last 25 years or more. So basically you have free electricity plus all that money in your pocket from not paying that electric bill for 20 years. So I can't emphasize this enough. If you have the right roof, your roof isn't too old and it's sunny, put solar on it. You will save money. It also increases the property value. So even if you think you're not going to be in your house for 5 years, still worth doing. Here's another scenario where we're talking about full electrification of your home. So solar, insulation, air sealing, electrification. I won't go through all these details. But the main thing to note here is that when you're trying to get to almost zero carbon emissions from your home, again, the payback time is less than a decade probably. And some of these estimates for your investment may be a little bit on the high side too. So your return on investment might even be sooner. But if you want the place to start, insulation and air sealing is really a great place to start because especially if you have a leaky home, you can reduce your energy bills by around 30%. So start there. This is a picture of a blower door test that I did in the house that I just moved into a couple weeks ago and found out my house is very leaky. And so now we know where to put the insulation and the air sealing to make it more airtight so we can be more energy efficient. All right, here's another scenario for you for if you have a home like my old home had a very shady roof, so I couldn't install solar. If you want to get rid of natural gas and electrify, to be honest with you, the savings aren't quite so much because natural gas is pretty cheap right now. If natural gas prices go up, then you're going to be saving more. So, but it's still worth doing if you care about the climate crisis. And let me talk a little bit more about that, why I think you still should be making these investments, even when you don't necessarily have an immediate return on investment. So let's talk about those folks here in Naperville that have some extra money to spare. If you look at the longest gray line on this graph, that is the carbon emissions for the wealthiest 10% of Americans. So that's more than 5 times the carbon emissions for a middle income American, and more than twice even for the top 10% of Europeans. I'm going to read this quote from the International Energy Agency for you. It says, "The richest group often has the largest financial means to adopt energy efficient and low emission solutions that involve high upfront costs. In doing so, they form the initial customer base that can help enable the manufacturing of these technologies to be brought to scale. So if you can count yourself in the top 10% of Americans being an early adopter of highly energy efficient technology, you're not just lowering your own carbon footprint, you're casting a carbon shadow that will move the technology to be more affordable and available to others. This has happened with electric vehicles already. And speaking of EVs, why not get an EV when it's time to replace your car? I personally have an EV. I love the convenience of fueling at my home and not having to take time off to get the oil changed. It's great technology. I'd be happy to answer any questions about that. I really can't recommend enough. EVs are coming. It's time to get on board with getting an EV. And then if you own a home, again, save your ears, save your lungs, and get electric lawn equipment. Naperville even has an incentive to help you defer the costs. Okay, last part of the evening, we're running up on the time when I want to start answering your questions. So I'll try to go through this quickly, but we're going to talk a little bit about our lifestyle choices and how they impact our carbon footprint. So I'm not going to ask this question again, because I heard a lot of these answers, what lifestyle changes you can make to reduce your carbon footprint. So I'm just going to move on and tell you that Project Drawdown, it's a research organization that studies climate solutions. And they say that the number 3 and 4 most impactful solutions that we have for climate change are to reduce food waste and to switch to a plant-rich diet. So the environmental and climate impacts of the way that we produce food include problems with deforestation, for example. What used to be a carbon sink becomes a carbon source. Deforestation happens mostly to raise livestock. And conventional agricultural practices also emit 11% of the United States greenhouse gas emissions. On a per kilogram basis, that big line at the top is beef. So if you can do one thing to change your diet, cut back on the amount of beef you eat, and you will be cutting back on your carbon footprint. I think one of the comments we had earlier was become a vegan. Probably more realistically, we all just cut back a little bit. When it comes to food waste, when you're wasting food, you're throwing away money. So save money and eat your leftovers. A lot of resources go into making food that goes straight into the garbage. Think of all that fossil fuel, the water, the fertilizer, and the land that's being used to make something that you just throw away. Eat your leftovers. And then there are also direct emissions from our food waste going into landfills, equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions from that is equivalent to driving 20.6 million cars in a year, or heating, cooling, lighting 11 million homes. So what we do about food waste is don't buy more than you need, eat what you have, and if you can, compost, turn that waste into a resource. The point of this lifestyle section is really that we start thinking more sustainably. So when we replace our vehicle trips with biking and walking, that can actually reduce the amount of carbon emissions, and it can actually even improve our quality of life. I know when I bike, instead of driving in my car when I have a short trip, it makes me healthier, it makes me happier. Somebody mentioned earlier that if you have a car that mostly just sits in the driveway and you don't really use it that much, you could actually you could take $340 Uber rides in a year and you would still be saving money and you would be saving carbon emissions. We can buy durable clothing and goods, learn to mend and repair. That's something that I'm working on personally right now to try to get better at that. Bring our reusable bags. For recycling, I always like to say recycling is not rocket science. We can all learn how to do it. And there's actually an app for it from our waste hauler groups. So you can look that up and get the group app and it will tell you if something is recyclable. I think we talked a little bit about flying being a source of carbon emissions. So you can think about maybe other ways to get around, and planting a garden is always great. So all these things don't seem to me like a big burden. They seem like they actually enhance your quality of life. All right. Almost to the end here. People who've seen me talk know I love to quote Jane Goodall, so I'm just going to read this. There is still so much in the world worth fighting for, so much that is beautiful, so many wonderful people working to reverse the harm, to help alleviate suffering, and so many young people dedicated to making this world better, all conspiring to inspire us and to give us hope that it is not too late to turn things around if we do our part. So if we start thinking that we have a carbon shadow that we can leave, that is going to be part of doing our part. And so I have a question for you, and then you can ask me some questions too. So after hearing all this, is there anything that you're inspired to do to take a step to cast a carbon shadow? And then I'll have happy to answer your questions as well.
So feel free now to ask any questions. I am going to change my view, I hope, to see everyone. Cathy, are you going to not share your screen?
Sure.
So
I can stop sharing. There we go.
There we go. Good. And be sure if you have a question. Now, see, I don't have any video on anyone, so I would say that if you have questions, please just put them in the chat. Here's a question. Does it make a useful difference if the modest amount of beef you eat is grass-fed from a local farm?
So in that graph that I showed, I didn't have time to point it out, but there was a little bit of a red section of the bar graph, and that represented the carbon emissions from the transporting the food. So actually, people like to eat local for a variety of reasons, to support local farmers and the local economy, but it really doesn't have a huge impact on carbon emissions. So as far as grass-fed versus grain-fed, I think that there are a lot of good reasons to do that, but maybe like the climate is not really the main driver of why you would want to eat grass-fed. So the main thing is like, maybe just eat less beef. You don't have to cut it out entirely, but just eat less.
And here's another question. How much is an air source heat pump compared to a gas furnace?
That is a really good question. So heat pumps, they both heat and cool your home. So they replace both your air conditioner and your furnace. So when you're comparing prices, you have to kind of add a furnace plus an AC. And I'm actually in the middle of investigating this for my new home. When we put our heat pump in our old home, the price was pretty much on par with a standard heat pump or a standard furnace and air conditioner. Adding those together, it was about the same price as an air source heat pump. The quotes that I have so far for the new house, it's a little more expensive, but it's a little more tricky to move our electricity to the place we need it. So a little more expensive, but chances are it's going to be slightly more expensive, but there are those rebates to help. I don't know if Tom Coleman, he's on here, if you have any more solid numbers on the cost of a heat pump.
It's from what I can see, it's just maybe slightly more expensive for the heat pump, AC. You have to add them both, as you say, Kathy. You can't just say the heating system, let's say a natural gas system or an air conditioner. You have to add them together because it replaces both of those things. And then, but if you're on, you're going to save, I think, an average. The government says $300 to $400 a year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but as Kathy said, gas, natural gas or methane gas, I like to call it, is cheap. The main thing is everything goes better with solar. Solar is the basis for the elimination of Naperville's coal and everything, in my view. So if you do solar, everything else becomes very, very cheap, including the heat pump.
Yes, absolutely. No reason not to electrify if you have a solar. It's super cheap.
Wonderful. We had another question. If we have a newer gas stove, should we replace it now with an electric one or wait until it wears out?
So that gets kind of to this idea that there's embodied carbon in whatever we purchase. So that means like all the carbon emissions that came from, extracting, processing, manufacturing, transporting that gas stove. So we call that embodied carbon. So you already have this big carbon debt from that. And if you just throw it away, then all of that was kind of for nothing. Gas stoves, as far as greenhouse gas emissions go, are pretty tiny fraction of your emissions from your home compared to like your heating or your water heating. So if your driver is really to reduce your carbon emissions, the gas stove is not your top priority. But if your driver is health and safety, then you want to get an induction stove because it makes your indoor air quality better, and you're also safer from all those things like fire and carbon monoxide.
Okay, thank you. We have one comment here. Electrification has downsides. As noted previously, Naperville's electricity comes through burning fossil fuels. Until that changes, using more electricity uses more fossil fuels. Car batteries require the mining of lithium and other minerals, which are destroying habitats in the areas of the mines. There's no free lunch, exclamation point. Do you comment on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to comment on that. Those are things that we hear a lot. And it is unfortunate that we are stuck in a contract here in Naperville where 80% of our electricity comes from coal. But electric appliances are so much significantly much more energy efficient than natural gas appliances. A heat pump can be, depending on the temperature, it can be 4 times more efficient than a gas furnace. So our carbon emissions actually are lower when we electrify our homes. We've done the same sort of analysis for our electric vehicles as well. And then as far as the mining of like lithium for our batteries, it is true that that does cause some environmental destruction, but there is also a lot of environmental destruction that comes from extraction of fossil fuels, that gasoline and, you know, petroleum. And that when you compare the destruction, that is worse. There's a lot of study on that. And the thing about the lithium batteries too, is that people are really working hard to solve those problems. So there are new ways of processing lithium. There are new battery technologies, like all of that is, people are working to address those problems. But if we really want to talk about the environmental damage from extraction, the extraction of fossil fuels really loses that race as far as, you know, just being really damaging.
All right, and then we have one more comment here. Why is there no legislation to prevent foreign companies from investing in Wisconsin Silver Maple Farm setting? Silver Maple Farm setting up a farm, coming to the Oshkosh Welsh settlement, taking over 2,200 acres of farmland. The Canadian company is the investment wing of the Ottawa Pension Fund. Wisconsin is being sourced to send this energy to Milwaukee and Chicago. There seems to be recourse for all the families that live there.
That is, I guess I don't really have a comment on that. I don't really know anything about that,
Okay.
that situation. But yeah, that's why, you know, organizations like the League of Women Voters that, you know, are really on the ground in communities and advocating, and local environmental organizations are really critical to, you know, prevent those kind of damages that might happen to local communities.
Okay. And then I'm going to thank Sandra for making us aware and casting her shadow. And it's an issue that we will pay more attention to. So thank you for that, Sandra. All right, I think that those are the comments that I have here, and it is 8 o'clock. So I would like to thank Cathy very much for a very informative and very clear presentation of the issues for all of us. We appreciate your expertise and your willingness to take the time to share what you know.
You bet. Thanks.
Okay.
Anyone's free to reach out to us if they have any more questions.
Sure. And if you enjoyed this event and appreciate the community and civic work of the League of Women Voters of Naperville, consider joining us. And you can do that by going to the website, to our join page. And in December, we will have our Ideas Forum. Will be a presentation from Dr. Anita Thomas, the new president of North Central College. So again, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for attending tonight.
Thanks, everyone. Oh,
Thank
I
you,
see
Cathy.
somebody has a comment. I'll put the
Okay.
contact info in there.
Okay. You're doing that now?
Yeah.
Okay, great.